faithfully delivering value and interpreting global great books. Hi, this is Ixmalaya Storytelling. Last episode, I interpreted Volume 2 of Postwar, A History of Europe Since 1945 by British historian Tony Judt. Today, we'll cover Volume 3, The Great Recession. 1971 to 1989. First, let's recap the key points from last episode. The thaw in relations between Western nations and the Soviet bloc created relatively peaceful order in Europe. Western Europe enjoyed economic prosperity in the 1960s, with some nations establishing comprehensive welfare systems, though crises were brewing beneath. On one hand, new leftist ideologies emerged in Western Europe, sparking continuous social movements among youth, signaling the end of prosperity, an entry into recession and turmoil. Meanwhile, the Soviet bloc stagnated despite reforms, sinking deeper into economic and political crises. In short, both sides faced severe challenges from the 1970s onward. So, what would become of them? Would Western and Eastern Europe confront further or move toward integration? Volume 3 of Postwar Europe History examines this question. I'll break it down into 3 parts. This book, Part 1, Economic Stagflation in Western Europe and Rise of Extremism. Part 2, Social Reforms and Political Shifts in Western Europe. Part 3, Dual Crises in Eastern Europe's Upheaval. All right, let's dive into Part 1, Economic Stagflation and Extremism in Western Europe. As covered previously, 1960s Western Europe saw major prosperity. UK, France, West Germany maintained high growth rates. Even less developed nations like Italy and Greece benefited, with living standards rising significantly. Yet, entering the 1970s, Western Europe plunged into prolonged stagflation. How did this happen? Simply put, stagflation resulted from economic crises combined with government countermeasures. And first, let's examine the economic crisis. Post-war prosperity was built on the Bretton Woods system. This dollar-centered system pegged USD to gold, with member currencies tied to USD as global settlement currency. What does that mean exactly? Say France trades with the US. Imports or exports, all settled in US dollars. France could exchange its earned US dollars for gold from the Federal Reserve at $35 per ounce. However, since the dollar-gold exchange rate was fixed and the franc was pegged to the dollar, holding dollars was equivalent to holding gold. So for France, exchanging for gold was redundant. The sensible choice was to keep dollars as foreign reserves, crucial for maintaining currency stability. The 1930s financial crisis swept through Western Europe with currency devaluations and widespread hardship, creating fertile ground for fascism. And now it was better, with Western European currencies tied to the dollar. As long as the dollar remained strong, they wouldn't repeat that disaster. Indeed, the Bretton Woods system safeguarded Western Europe's economic prosperity. But what if the dollar itself faltered? This wasn't alarmist talk. Since the mid-1960s, America's full involvement in the Vietnam War caused military spending to soar annually. Plus, massive imports of energy and goods forced increased dollar printing, inevitably devaluing the currency. In real terms, gold already exceeded $35 per ounce.
Yet, under Bretton Woods, the U.S. had to maintain this rate. Central banks, spotting profit, exchanged dollars for gold, crashing the U.S. global gold reserve share from 75% to 30%.
The Federal Reserve was nearly drained dry. In August 1971, President Nixon unilaterally ended the fixed dollar-gold exchange rate, shifting to free float. Simultaneously, the Fed stopped dollar-gold conversions. The dollar plummeted, dragging down pegged Western European currencies, triggering hyperinflation. Within 2 years, global food prices doubled and general goods rose 70%. Western Europe buckled under pressure. In 1973, they announced currency decoupling from the dollar, adopting floating rates too. The Bretton Woods system collapsed then, and as misfortune never comes alone, the oil crisis followed immediately. In 1973, the Fourth Middle East War erupted. To retaliate against Western support for Israel, Arab nations slashed oil production, causing crude prices to surge 200%. By then, oil had replaced coal as Western Europe's primary energy source, powering metallurgy, chemicals, utilities, transportation, and more. Therefore, rising crude oil prices increased production costs across the board, forcing companies to lay off workers. Making matters worse, the 1979 Iranian Revolution caused market panic, sending oil prices up another 150%. Combined with the collapse of Bretton Woods and two oil crises, this continuously drove up inflation and unemployment in Western Europe. Statistics show that from 1973 to 1979, France's average annual inflation exceeded 10%, while Italy's surpassed 16%. The UK briefly exceeded 24% in its worst year, while unemployment across Western Europe generally topped 7%, unprecedented since the economic boom. Governments had to intervene, yet their very countermeasures pushed society into stagflation. First, 12 Western European nations established the European Monetary System in 1978, requiring fixed exchange rates among members while floating collectively against the dollar. This pooled Western Europe's strength to counter the dollar's decline. And while not fundamentally stabilizing currencies, it helped slow inflation trends. Meanwhile, governments pledged not to cut social welfare, easing public anxieties. So, moreover, to preserve jobs, they eased credit for businesses, even breaking norms to directly prop up key industries. For instance, Sweden heavily subsidized shipbuilding, while the UK and France provided textile worker wage supports. Italy established a wage index to ensure steady worker pay growth. All right, to match rising prices, immigration thresholds were raised to reserve jobs for locals. West Germany used this approach to expel 300,000 immigrants. These measures protected labor rights, satisfying unions. Hence, worker protests and strikes were relatively infrequent in these years, but this came at two costs. First, governments shouldered heavy burdens with fiscal deficits climbing yearly. Nations like the UK and France faced budget shortfalls, forcing IMF bailouts. These deficits further hampered the economy. The UK's GDP growth slid from 3% to 1.5%, nearly halved. Even West Germany, the strongest performer, dropped from 6% to just above 5%. Second, subsidies only protected existing jobs but couldn't create new ones. Thus, for youth entering society, opportunities dwindled, job difficulties skyrocketed, causing structural unemployment. So, in Western European countries, this became a common sight. On one hand, economic stagnation or even decline, with young folks unable to find jobs. On the other hand, those with jobs still kept high wages and generous benefits. This meant actual wage growth outpaced productivity gains, corporate profits kept falling, no new investments came in. That's what we call stagnation. Inflation, or stagflation for short. Under stagflation, Western Europe kept up a facade of prosperity, but really, it was stuck in a slow, irreversible economic slump. Folks felt gloomy about the future, seen in the birth rate dropping, because nobody wanted kids anymore. Early post-war, the average British woman had 2.71 kids. By the late 70s, it fell to 1.84. In France, it dropped from 2.73 to 1.73. More and more people opted out of marriage and kids. Sure, for regular folks, this society still offered basic security. Goods were plentiful, entertainment was everywhere, but no big progress happened. Life got steady, even kind of dull.
This bored and depressed the youth. Some got desperate, brewing extreme antisocial feelings and turning to terror acts.
In 1977, an extremist group called the Red Army Faction carried out terror attacks in West Germany, killing big shots like Daimler-Benz's chairman, the federal attorney general, and Dresdner Bank's chairman, shocking the world. In 1980, terrorists claiming to be neo-Nazis planned the Munich Oktoberfest bombing, killing 13, and injuring over 220. This wasn't a one-off. Similar extremist groups popped up in France, Belgium, and Italy. In Italy, even ex-prime ministers and counter-terror leaders got killed, blanketing Western Europe in fear. On the surface, these extremist groups had their excuses, trying to justify their terror acts. But the author says don't buy it because they don't even follow their own rules. For instance, neo-Nazis claimed they only targeted Jews and immigrants. But when they acted, they didn't pick and choose. Truth is, most of these extremist groups had no clear political goals or plans. They were more like antisocial types just venting rage for the sake of it. That anger came from the powerlessness young people felt after years of stagflation. Well, facing stagflation and its consequences, reform is inevitable. But where to start? Part 2. Social reforms and political changes in the Western world. I'll explain how this reform unfolded and the new political landscape it brought. Among Western European countries, Britain's stagflation was the most severe, so its reforms were also the most representative. Since World War II, the long-ruling left-wing Labour Party in Britain built a comprehensive welfare system from cradle to grave. And this system relied on two major policy safeguards: industrial nationalization and progressive income tax. Upon taking office, Labour successively nationalized industries like civil aviation, domestic transport, shipbuilding, pharmaceuticals, coal, electricity, gas, and steel, making state-owned enterprises reach 20% of Britain's industrial sector and 11% of GDP. These SOEs absorbed a huge workforce and rarely laid off workers, helping the government keep unemployment low, while their taxes funded social welfare. So, meanwhile, Labour implemented a progressive income tax, heavily taxing high earners and the middle class to promote wealth redistribution. Clearly, the working class were the biggest beneficiaries of these policies. Under the full welfare system, they had job security and social benefits, so workers became Labour's main supporters. However, this model was hard to sustain. On one hand, over time, the inefficiency of Britain's SOEs became glaring. They stopped making profits and needed massive subsidies. In 1979 alone, it hit £1.8 billion. On the other hand, the government had to maintain high wages and welfare, so it kept boosting fiscal spending. Amid currency devaluation and rising prices, this was like drinking poison to quench thirst, worsening stagflation. In the late 1970s, Labour, financially strained, slashed spending, cutting SOE subsidies and welfare, causing unemployment to soar.
In 1977, UK unemployment hit 1.6 million, the worst since the war, sparking nationwide protests.
At its peak, transport froze, shops shut, garbage and corpses piled up, society near collapsed. Labour lost support and lost the 1979 election.
Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party took over Downing Street, and she became Britain's first female Prime Minister.
If you thought Thatcher would revert to high welfare policies, you'd be wrong. In reality, she not only continued cutting fiscal spending, but sold off all state-owned shares, sparking privatization that clearly hurt working-class interests. Protests and strikes erupted everywhere. Thatcher remained unmoved, even pushing Parliament to pass laws strictly limiting strikes. This time, even conservatives felt she'd gone too far and demanded adjustments. Thatcher retorted, "You change if you wish. The Prime Minister won't," earning her the Iron Lady title. Labour's reforms had barely started before their disgraceful ousting. Thatcher went further. So why did her reforms stick? Where did her confidence actually come from? Her confidence came from the middle class, who'd thrived during economic prosperity. During those years, Western Europe underwent deep industrial shifts. Traditional manufacturing like coal mining, steel, and smelting moved to developing nations, slashing local blue-collar jobs and union power. And their replacements were white-collar workers, entrepreneurs, and civil servants, forming the new middle class. Thatcher keenly seized this shift to craft her reform strategy. Privatizing industries broke workers' rice bowls, but left the middle class unscathed. So during workers' protests, the middle class stayed silent, even when thousands of miners clashed with mounted police in violent confrontations. Plus, selling state shares boosted fiscal revenue. In 1984, telecom privatization netted the government £3.7 billion. In 1986, gas company privatization earned £4.25 billion. This revenue replenished coffers, preserving basic welfare and stabilizing the middle class. Crucially, Thatcher firmly believed privatization would revitalize the economy. For that, even reduced welfare seemed acceptable to the middle class. Essentially, this was social reform achieved by undermining workers to court the middle class. Thatcher's strategy worked. After weathering 2 initial years of decline, Britain's economy showed recovery signs, and middle-class support for conservatives surged dramatically. In the 1983 election, Margaret Thatcher won re-election by a landslide, while the Labour Party got only 27.6% of votes, its worst result since World War I. In 1987, Thatcher won yet another election, reaching the peak of her prestige. Thatcher not only led Britain out of stagflation, but profoundly reshaped its political landscape. How to understand this? Traditionally, conservatives were right-wing, seen as representing bourgeois interests. Labor was left-wing, representing working-class interests. Their political platforms fundamentally diverged, but Thatcher's success forced Labor to confront reality. Their working-class base had dwindled. To survive, they had to pivot toward the middle class. Labor made a 180-degree turn, crafting policies aligned with middle-class needs. Thus, both parties targeted the middle class as their core constituency, shrinking their ideological differences. The left-right divide blurred. This convergence wasn't unique to Britain, but common across Western Europe. In France, François Mitterrand, leader of the left-wing Socialist Party, was elected president in 1981 with leftist backing. Yet soon after taking office, Mitterrand launched reforms pulling state capital from chemicals, insurance, and pharma, mirroring Thatcher's approach. And then, like Britain, France's left shifted to the middle class due to working-class decline, causing left-right parties to merge agendas. Parties refocused social issues around middle-class preferences. Previously, Western Europe's middle class worried about grand issues like East-West confrontations sparking war. By the mid-1970s, Western nations and the Soviet bloc signed the Helsinki Accords, pledging mutual respect and peace, easing war fears. Interest in global affairs waned, shifting to domestic policies affecting daily lives. These issues split into 2 main categories: women's rights and environmental protection. First, women's rights. Traditionally, European women didn't work outside home, but post-war male shortages changed this. Though governments encouraged female employment, by the 1970s, it had become commonplace. According to statistics, from 1972 to 1980, Italy added 1.5 million new workers, 83% of whom were women. Half of married women in West Germany had jobs. Across Western Europe by 1990, women comprised over 40% of the workforce, yet their situation remained challenging. Most held lower-tier jobs, like nurses, clerks, or servers, often earning less than men, sparking calls for equal pay. Governments enacted laws improving some working conditions, but many women sought reproductive freedom, while most Western European nations still banned abortion. In April 1971, 343 French women signed a petition demanding legal reform. Signatories included Simone de Beauvoir, author of The Second Sex, Françoise Sagan, Bonjour Tristesse, and actress Catherine Deneuve. The petition swayed public opinion, leading France to legalize abortion. As their social status rose, women entered politics. Nordic nations led this charge. By 1990, women held 39% of Finland's parliamentary seats. with similar rates in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Now, the second political issue, environmental protection. Early industrialization blanketed Europe in mines and factories, fueling growth but creating massive pollution. London, for instance, was nicknamed the Foggy City due to constant smog. In 1952, 1956, and 1962, severe public health crises struck London. Tens of thousands died from smog-induced illnesses, catalyzing the environmental movement. The 1973 oil crisis became a pivotal moment for its rise. Facing soaring oil prices, environmentalists urged abandoning polluting fossil fuels for clean energy like wind and solar. In 1980, West German activists formed the Green Party, winning 2.16 million votes and 27 parliamentary seats in 1983 elections. Though initially small, this secured their place in parliament as a formidable social force. Inspired by this, environmentalists in other Western European countries established green parties to compete politically. Mainstream parties saw public sentiment shifting and began incorporating environmental protection into their platforms to attract voters. Notably, the environmental movement in Western Europe also sparked strong reactions in the Eastern Bloc. The reason is simple. They faced similar issues. The Eastern Bloc's heavy industry strategy inherently caused pollution, and with outdated technology, the situation grew increasingly dire. For example, Poland's Nowa Huta steel city had about 20 steel plants, producing 17 million tons of steel annually. Yet, until 1989, most steel plants still used highly polluting open hearth furnaces, and the Soviet Union itself was even worse off. In Central Asia, the Soviet Union recklessly developed the Aral Sea, causing this world's fourth largest lake to shrink drastically. In Norilsk, Siberia's mining hub, long-term production of copper and nickel created a sulfur dioxide pollution zone the size of Italy. In the Arctic Ocean, the Soviet Union dumped hundreds of thousands of tons of waste fuel, but the most shocking incidents were nuclear leaks. So,
In 1957, a nuclear reactor in Chelyabinsk at the eastern foothills of the Ural Mountains exploded due to old equipment and poor management, contaminating a 100 square kilometer area.
This incident was covered up by the Soviet government, and the outside world knew nothing about it. On the early morning of April 26, 1986, an explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear plant in Ukraine released radioactive material over 100 times more than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs combined. 5 million people were exposed to radiation, with radioactive fallout spreading as far as the UK, marking humanity's most severe nuclear accident. Sally's book talk specifically covered historian Serhiy Plokhy's authoritative work on this. Chernobyl is a tragedy. Listeners wanting deeper insights can tune in for more. After Chernobyl, the outside world realized the environmental crisis in the Eastern Bloc was already severe. Further observation showed this was just a microcosm of its overall crisis. In reality, the Eastern Bloc faced deeper, more severe crises. Mishandling them would have catastrophic consequences. Part 3. Internal and External Crises, and the Upheaval in Eastern Europe. I will now narrate this process. As covered last episode, since 1968, Eastern Europe implemented new economic systems that improved livelihoods but didn't solve core issues due to 3 inherent flaws in the Soviet model. Which 3? First, imbalance in the national economy. The Soviet model overemphasized heavy industry, funneling resources into steel, defense, aerospace, etc., while chronically underfunding agriculture and light industries. This forced reliance on imports for daily necessities like food and consumer goods. The second flaw, rigid institutions and inefficiency. The Soviet model enforced strict central planning, but how strict? Lower-tier enterprises had to rigidly execute plans from superiors, even when outdated, and these plans micromanaged every detail. They dictated everything: raw material sourcing, production, pricing, sales, even fixed employee salaries. Zero autonomy bred inefficiency and slack. The author compared: for a basket of basics like eggs, milk, sausages, and potatoes in March 1979, a Washington worker needed 12.5 hours to afford it, a Londoner 21.4 hours. How about a Muscovite? 42.3 hours, revealing shockingly low productivity. Now, the third major flaw, unique to Eastern Europe, the so-called international division of labor. The USSR believed Eastern Bloc nations should specialize. Some grow grain, others export raw materials, others develop heavy industry. Problem? This division was unilaterally imposed by Moscow, ignoring realities. Thus, iron-poor Czechoslovakia mass-produced steel, while technologically backward Hungary made tractors and buses. In the 1980s, the USSR even assigned East Germany to develop PCs. They succeeded, however, but quality was so poor, even Soviets rejected them. Zero market competitiveness. No and no. Vast resources were wasted, yet Soviet leaders stayed obstinate. They allowed minor reforms to improve living standards, but never let Eastern Europe abandon the Soviet model. So Eastern Europe's reforms became a cycle: change when desperate, stop at early gains, restart when benefits dried up. This repeating pattern frustrated Eastern governments. With prosperous Western Europe next door, the contrast was jarring. They couldn't convince people this was normal. Long-term rule destabilized. Only raising living standards could ease discontent. So where does the money come from? Let's first look at East Germany, at the forefront of the Eastern Bloc. In 1973, East Germany and West Germany reached an agreement to mutually recognize each other as legitimate states, and the UN simultaneously admitted both as member nations. After that, East Germany made money by playing the family card, specifically by facilitating reunions for separated families across the border, with all costs covered by West Germany.
By 1989, East Germany had facilitated reunions for 250,000 separated families, with about 2,000 children returning to parents, capitalizing on this to collect nearly 3 billion marks, then using the money to import consumer goods for its people.
But this trick was only usable by East Germany. Other Eastern European countries had no such option. Their only path was massive foreign borrowing. Data shows that Eastern Europe's dollar debt was $6.01 in 1971, soaring to $95.06 by 1988, a 15-fold increase. How was the borrowed money allocated?
2/3 went to interest payments, and 1/3 subsidized domestic consumption.
Through this method, ordinary people in Eastern Europe could own TVs, washing machines, and private cars. Of course, these were all imported. Domestic manufacturing was, well, hard to praise. Eastern Europe's loans mainly came from Western countries. Why were they willing to lend? The author believes an important reason was that the economic indicators and statistics from Eastern European countries created an illusion for the West that the East was strong and had no debt repayment pressure. In 1989, renowned American economist Paul Samuelson updated his classic textbook, Economics, claiming in it that the Soviet model worked well and the Eastern Bloc was thriving, but in reality, a storm was approaching. From June to December 1989, in just half a year, the ruling parties in Eastern European countries fell one after another, and the Soviet bloc collapsed dramatically, greatly surprising the West. How did it all happen? That's this. To summarize, there were two major factors, internal and external.
First, the internal cause is simple. Borrowing to boost consumption is inherently unsustainable because it not only piles up government debt, but also drives up prices.
Take Poland as an example. In 1987, consumer prices rose by 25%, and the next year by 80%, causing widespread public anger. The ruling Polish United Workers' Party had to let the people choose whether bread prices should rise by 50% and gasoline by 100%, or vice versa. I think, well, the answer's obvious. Nobody wanted either, but inflation was already unstoppable. By 1989, prices in Poland had skyrocketed tenfold. The same happened across Eastern Europe, with public discontent steadily rising.
And increasingly targeting the regimes, protests and strikes became frequent occurrences.
Yet, at this stage, it wasn't out of control. Places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia temporarily stabilized by changing leaders.
The fatal blow came externally when the USSR, which had tightly controlled Eastern Europe, suddenly let go. Instantly, Eastern governments lost their strongest support and quickly collapsed under opposition pressure.
So here's the question. Why did the Soviet Union abandon Eastern Europe?
We'll explain through political and economic lenses. First, politics. In late 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan drew global condemnation, leading to a Western boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader and finally withdrew all troops from Afghanistan. Intervening in Eastern Europe now risked even greater political isolation. Gorbachev felt this was unaffordable politically and economically, too. The flaws plaguing Eastern Europe under the Soviet model? The USSR itself was declining, and worse. Its survival largely depended on oil exports. The 1970s oil crises spiked prices from $15 to $39 per barrel. As a major oil power, the USSR reaped huge profits. The Soviet government used oil revenue to import food and consumer goods for domestic supply. But from the mid-1980s, oil prices plummeted yearly, even dipping below $10 per barrel. The Soviet economy tanked, hyperinflation and shortages worsened. With no choice, the Soviet government resorted to heavy borrowing. By 1989, the USSR was saddled with $54 billion in foreign debt. In this crisis, Gorbachev had to adopt foreign policy retrenchment to cut spending. The USSR no longer had the strength it showed in Hungary, 1956, or Czechoslovakia, 68. So when Eastern Europe begged for help, he shrugged. Impossible to manage. Poland was the first to fall. In June 1989, Poland held parliamentary elections with shocking results. The main opposition group, Solidarity, won 99 out of 100 Senate seats and 160 out of 161 seats in the Sejm. The ruling Polish United Workers' Party only got 2 members elected.
Then, driven by solidarity, Poland became the first Eastern European nation to break from the Soviet bloc, triggering a chain reaction. Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania saw upheavals. The Soviet bloc collapsed, with the Berlin Wall demolition as a landmark event.
The Berlin Wall was built in 1961, splitting Europe in two and isolating East-West contact. On November 9, 1989, East Germany announced the wall's fall and opened borders. This iconic moment of Eastern Europe's transformation captured global attention. By the 1990s, Eastern Europe's old regimes had all fallen, radically reshaping Europe's geopolitics. With the Soviet bloc reduced to just the USSR, the power balance with the West completely reversed. How would the Cold War evolve? And what fate awaited the Soviet Union? Meanwhile, Eastern Europe, undergoing political transformation, yearned to rejoin the Western Bloc. But what awaited them? This will be covered in Volume 4, the final volume. All right, that concludes our interpretation of Post-War Europe Volume 3, The Great Recession, 1971 to 1989. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time. I'm Boston Wallace. Oh my God.